Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing well. Welcome back to part 2 of building IG-11, except that's not actually what we're doing today because, surprise, we're building IG-12. If you missed my last video, I managed to get an entire life-size IG-11 3D printed in 10 days, and today we are going to be taking asterisk most of those pieces and turning them into a droid that hopefully looks like it walked straight off of the Mandalorian set. But I did just want to mention that in this intro that I've now had to film for the second time, because when I started this second part of the IG building process, IG-12 did not exist yet. So in the beginning section I will still be talking about making IG-11, and then you will see me later on in a bit flipping to working on the IG-12 pieces. But now that you know everything that's going on, let's get into some droid building. Here is how IG is doing at the moment. I had to take them all apart so that I can start sanding these pieces, and I figured why not lay all of them out so that I can see them all together on this table. And it does look super cool. And it also gives you a good idea as to exactly how many pieces are involved in a life-size droid. In fact, I have this bucket here of even more pieces that I just could not fit laid out flat, and there's even some stacked, like that's technically 3 pieces, and then I still have the different greebly bits and stuff attached to his head. Something that I just completely forgot to mention in the last video is that he took me 13.5 kilograms roughly of filament. So I guess without further ado, let's start post-processing these pieces. Since all of the pieces already had all of the supports removed, the first thing I did was melt any of these super rough areas with my hot knife wood-burning multi-tool thing. This really just helps in smoothing things out before going in and sanding anything. And I'm sure most of you are well aware by now that the first step in my sanding process is going over the largest areas with my foot sander. Still the greatest tool to sand 3D prints with, although I did have to still go in with some sandpaper into any of the tighter areas. Now there's obviously like just an overwhelming amount of pieces that needed sanding, to the point that I managed to convince my mom to help me with this. She's a big fan of the foot sander, let me tell you. Here is the state of the table after 2 days of basically non-stop sanding. Most of the sanded pieces are on the ground, so you can vaguely see that clearly have not gotten through a lot. I've been doing mostly large pieces though, so these small guys aren't of like so much concern, I guess, because, you know, I've been spending my time doing massive things that take 4 times as long. So today I want to actually add some thinned out Bondo onto things, especially like this incredibly messy foot that's going to need a ton of work done on it. This is actually the first time that I used the spot putty and acetone mixture to thin it out and brush it on, and this is absolutely going to be how I apply any spot putty from now on. It just makes it so much easier, especially when you're getting into pieces like this foot piece that have so many crevices. It would just be like impossible to apply any other way than with a brush. It also makes the Bondo go a lot farther. I use this technique on the majority of these pieces, and my final Bondo tube count at the end of this was 3, which is pretty great considering just the sheer surface area on all of these parts. The other thing that you're going to see me use a lot of in this video is filler primer. Now I had 1 random can of red, which is what you can see me using here, but the majority of it will be gray in this video. I very quickly sanded the spot putty off of this thigh piece just so that I could see what 1 coat of filler primer looked on it, and it's looking really good. I only sanded it with a 180 grit sandpaper, so the like slight roughness isn't necessarily from like layer lines, more that it's just, you know, didn't get sanded with a very fine grit sandpaper. So this might only really need like 1-2 more rounds of sanding, and I don't think it's going to need any more filler primer or anything on it, and just like the final black coat, whatever I want to put on it before it actually gets painted. So that's super exciting to know that things are, you know, sanding well, and if I don't have to do like 5 layers on each piece of like different filler and filler primer and whatever, then that's going to save me a ton of time. This would probably be a great time to mention that when I was doing all of this prep work, it was still the height of Canadian winter, so attempting to spray all of this different stuff in the out of doors was quite challenging, but I rigged up some different sets and managed to make it work. But that is also why I was using so much Bondo in this process as well, because that is not temperature sensitive. Like, really, at this point I was trying to do any other methods that I possibly could to make these pieces smoother that didn't involve needing to spray filler primer, because I didn't know how well that was going to work given the interesting weather still. So I'm back inside with a bin full of parts because these, well, that one's like not prepped at all, but most of the ones in here are good to the point where I really need to start bulking up certain areas with my resin filler, and I figured might as well bring them inside where I can comfortably watch things while I work. I also need to mix up more of my resin filler, so I figured I would show you what I do for that as well. Not that I have a particular recipe, but I'll be using fumed silica and this particular resin this time around. I'm using up this bottle. I don't really print with white, so I figured might as well use this for something else. I like mixing my resin filler up in one of these metal screw top containers. It's completely sealed off from any rogue UV light, so you never have to worry about this stuff accidentally curing. And I really don't have any recipe or ratio for this mixture. In fact, I tend to switch it every time that I make it, depending on what I'm planning on using this batch for. So because this was for the more deeper recesses in these prints, like when they're still pretty messed up, I did end up making it a bit thicker, just so that it could smooth out all of those areas a lot easier than a thinner mixture would. I still build it up in multiple coats though. In between doing all of this various prep work on these pieces, this was around the time where IG-12 actually became a thing. So while I was still working on all of the pieces I already had, I did set up my printers running off all of the new IG-12 pieces, which is mostly the torso section, although I did elect to reprint some other pieces both in resin and just newer, different versions of ones that I'd already printed, like the head for example, because originally I printed the animatronic version, which was now no longer going to be able to work with the IG-12 body. Here's an incredibly rough look at what some of the IG-12 parts look like put together. That's not the Grogu that's going to be going in this. That was just the one that was most readily available for my mom to grab to put in to see what it looked like. Yeah, there's all of these other parts off to the side, but that's like the main body structure. All of the other parts are the same between IG-11 and 12. It's just pretty much the torso. There are some new shoulder bits that are like more suspended, and then like a bit of a back panel, but overall it's pretty open since Grogu does sort of take up most of the middle. But since everything now is printed, it is time to start continuing on with the prep work for all of these pieces. There are also all of these resin pieces. Some of them are IG-12 like new specific ones, and other ones were just pieces that I wanted to reprint in resin because I didn't feel like fighting with sanding things constantly. But since these are resin, they're going to involve very little prep work, so they're just going to stay in the box there for now until I'm way further closer to finishing this droid. Some of the pieces are finally looking good enough to start assembling them. I like to keep everything as small as possible so that it's easier to work on, but these lower leg slash shin pieces were ready to be assembled, especially since there would be a pretty big seam that I'd have to deal with later. These pieces were printed in PETG, so I did use this JB Weld plastic bonder, which I do really like, and you will see me use a ton in this video. I also glued on this kneecap cover piece thing to this shin piece because in all of the reference there doesn't appear to be any visible seam. So I wanted to make sure that was permanently attached so that I could go ahead and make that seam disappear so that everything looked like it was welded together and in one piece. I did the same thing for the top kneecap cover. Again, it looked like it was all welded together and in one piece. After a bit more prep work, I did also adhere this upper kneecap piece to the thigh piece. This really did look welded together, so to give it that effect, I used some UV resin in a bottle so that I could just put it in that fine little crack and cure it. Obviously, for the sake of this video, I've condensed all of this prep work as much as I can, but I really want to stress to you all just how long it's taken to get to this point to somewhat start having some final looking pieces that are smooth enough. We're talking probably hundreds of hours worth of sanding, bondoing, sanding again, adding filler primer, sanding that off. But I really just wanted to try to convey that projects like this do take a ton of post-processing time, especially when you're a perfectionist like me. I know some people use the 6-foot rule where it's as long as it looks good from 6 feet away, then that's good enough. I operate on more of a 6-inch rule. Like, I can confidently say that you will not be able to find a single layer line on this entire droid. But anyway, back to what I'm actually working on in this footage. I got the 2 halves of the lower part of the torso pre-prepped enough that I felt like I could attach them without issue. Of course, started working on the seam for those 2 pieces as well. And then I attached the upper segment to the main torso structure because, again, there were seams that I was going to have to deal with and smooth out. And after a lot of sanding, I got its final coat of filler primer on it. I can't believe I'm gonna say this, but it's actually time to start painting all of these pieces. We've got the bucket there of everything that's had its final 400 grit sand job done on it. We've got a decent amount of IG there, minus the little leg poles. There's pieces everywhere. Heads over here. I've been trying out a bunch of different types of paint and just generally trying to figure out a game plan for all of these pieces, which I still need to figure out the logistics of because some of these are getting airbrush painted, some of them need silver underneath another color. Just there is obviously a lot of pieces and they're not all silver. So the only thing for sure that I know some pieces are getting done in this dupla color. What is this? This is a Nissan color. It is called dark gray metallic. This is basically the only thing that I found that I'm happy with after testing out just about every single type of silver imaginable. There is even more than this. These are just the ones that were okay enough to consider, which some of them I might still be using underneath other pieces depending on the tone of silver metal that they might be. But overall, the main problem with all of these is that they are too bright of a silver when the pieces that are actually like exposed fully silver on IG are more of this gunmetal color. I will be talking about it in more detail when I'm doing everything, like full painting tutorial basically, but step 1 for me is going to be figuring out what pieces need what color on them first. I started off with the easy stuff, things that I knew 100% just needed that automotive metallic gray color, so the shin pieces, various pieces on the upper torso and head, the fingers. But there were a couple of pieces I wanted to spray in a gloss black base first and then add the gunmetal color, like the feet, but there was also some that I just wanted to be gloss black because I wanted to add a different metallic to them. And that would be this alclad lacquer in the color chrome. This stuff is incredible. It always looks the best over a flawless glossy black base, so for these hip pieces I did actually spray paint those, but the gloss spray paint I was using was a bit weird, so I did flip to actually using the alclad gloss lacquer base, which always looks incredible. So you can see me airbrushing that on here to the upper parts of the feet as well as the ankle parts on the bottom of the shin pieces, and then going in with the chrome. I modeled myself a couple of detail pieces to add to the torso parts. They were just something that I noticed when I was like heavily staring at reference photos, and I wanted to have this be as accurate as possible. Droid Division has since added pieces for these, I believe, so now they're part of the main file, but wanted to get those attached before going ahead and prepping the front section of the torso piece where it is definitely that chrome color. This is one of the most awkward pieces to paint because you have 2 completely opposing textures going on the single piece, whereas most of these pieces, like this secondary tier of the torso, is all just the chrome. For this lower torso section, I didn't bother masking the part parts that didn't need to be chrome. It was just going to be an unnecessary step because it was going to get completely painted over later. And thankfully, most of the other pieces were completely chrome without needing any masking. For a lot of these smaller detail pieces, I did have to switch to using Duralumin because I was getting really low on the Alclad chrome, and I apparently bought out the entire country stockpile of the Alclad, but I had a liter of Duralumin sitting in my closet, and it is a very similar finish, so that is what I ended up using on all of these smaller pieces. There were some parts, however, that were entirely done in spray paint, like the thighs. First, I got a layer of that metallic gunmetal spray paint before I masked off the top and bottom section and then sprayed the middle pole area in a medium brown. There were some parts that I'd already done the chroming to that now needed a layer of spray paint, like these thigh pieces, masked off the bottom and sprayed the upper part this off-white, extremely light gray color. The same color got added to the bottom section of the torso, as well as these thigh guard plates. Now these I did sort of a little bit of an experiment with layers of spray paint, so I lightly misted it with the same brown that I used on the thighs, went back over that with the light gray just to tone it down a bit. And that same light gray got added to a couple of sections of the headpiece that already had that gunmetal color as a base coat. Now this is possibly the greatest discovery that I made during this entire building process. I'm gonna call this the tape ball masking technique, which all it is I took a wad of used masking tape that I had taken off of some other piece, balled it up, and dipped it in masking fluid to create these randomized scratching patterns to as closely replicate the weathering on, at this point, the back panel of IG-12. But this was so easy and it worked so well. It just gave the perfect randomized chipping effect that is so difficult to replicate because you're having to manufacture this weathering, and I used this on a bunch of pieces that needed this sort of look. So once the masking fluid had dried for these back panels, I sprayed it in the Sahara Beige Montana Gold color, which is pretty infamously Battle Droid beige. The upper arm sections also got sprayed in this, but then they also got the stripe on the side chromed. The last step in this base coat process was the bottom ring of the head. But then it was time to move inside with all of these pieces to really take them from that flat base coat to something that's going to look like it walked straight off of the Mandalorian set. We're going to start at the feet and work our way up. Now this foot as is looks quite good, but adding a bit of simple weathering really takes it to the next level. For this, all you're going to need is a bit of black and brown acrylic paint. This was heavy body acrylic paint, although you are thinning it down with water, so it really doesn't matter whether you're using a heavier body acrylic or more of like a thinner craft paint. And all I'm doing is taking a bit of that on a brush, patting it around, tapping it, making like a grimy, rough texture, and then going in with a paper towel and blotting a lot of it off. You will be left with a bit of texture and just griminess, I guess you could call it. So you do want to build this up gradually, adding more depth and grime into more of the recessed areas and anywhere that would just naturally build up more dirt and debris. The next step up from this technique is what I'm going to call rust paste, which is just brown acrylic paint mixed in with baking soda, and it creates this slightly sandy, gritty texture that for the shin parts of the legs looked absolutely perfect. To apply this, I used a fairly large bristly brush and just sort of tapped it all over the surface to create like an uneven, rusty texture. Sometimes I would pat it on a bit of paper towel just to get rid of any extra, because you don't necessarily want to apply it super thick all over. It's kind of hard to tell what's going on from the leg reference photo that I had, but from what I can see, this looked super convincing for the shins as well as the upper thigh pieces. It really comes off convincingly as being rust, and you can also change the color, so if you want it like darker in the creases and stuff, you can easily add a black wash or paint it, or just overall increase the depth in areas or change the color in areas where you want it to be a little different. All of the different weathering techniques that I was using got repeated over various other pieces. Like these hip pieces, for example, I went in with the brown and black acrylic paint mixture into the creases, the recessed areas, to just grime it up, give it a bit of texture, make it look more realistic. I also continued that type of weathering on all of the metallic areas of these hip pieces. These also had masking fluid applied to them earlier, so took that off since I felt the weathering was at a good point. I also used one of these wire sponges to help remove the masking fluid and just generally give it a bit more scratching texture. The thigh covers, center hip, and lower torso, as well as the arms technically, were all the same color, so I needed to try and make them all match. Starting with the hip covers, I used my airbrush to spray on basically dirty paint water. It's just more convenient for me than trying to apply all of this with a brush, especially for these larger pieces. It just gives it really nice even coverage, and then you can go in with a paper towel, blot it off. Sometimes I would spray even more water onto the piece to help remove even more of that paint color. And the weathering on these thigh covers are more of a gradient, so they're much darker at the upper part where they connect to the hips than they are at the ends. I did do a few layers going back and forth between spraying it with an off-white, like light gray color to push the weathering back a little, and then re-adding some more weathering just to give it some nice dimension. Same thing for this lower torso section. I started off with overspraying the entire thing with a slightly darker tan color. This was mostly to try and get it to match all of the other pieces I'd already painted, but then it was back to the dirty paint water, spray it with more water, blot it off with a paper towel, and continue on. I have to mention, it did take me like an entire day just to try and get all of these off-white pieces to match. The weathering techniques are a fairly loose process, so even if I do the exact same thing over all of the pieces, it can end up looking completely different. So I had to darken up some areas more, lighten some areas more to try and balance all of the colors out, but thankfully I think I was successful in making everything look like it was the same color. So went ahead, removed all of the tape on this torso piece and all of the masking fluid, and I did of course end up weathering all of that metallic area as well later. There were a couple of specific steps for this upper panel piece though. First was airbrushing the center section a lighter gray than the chrome base that was on it, and then the surrounding area was oversprayed with a darker gunmetal color. And of course I added a bit of weathering into this too, just so that it matched the rest of the weathering on the torso. There is also some masking fluid applied on this piece to create the chipping effect so you can still see the chrome underneath. There were a lot of smaller pieces and pipe and piston details that I did add a bit of the acrylic weathering to. All of the back canister pieces did get quite a lot done to them though. I used a metallic black paint and stippled that all over the recessed panel parts. The bands all stayed silver just with a bit of weathering. And blotting or stippling on the paint with a brush really gave it the perfect texture, and that also was for the larger back canisters as well. Now onto the shoulder frame pieces. I did already paint this cylinder with some of the rust paste mixture, but we're going to be painting the remainder of the frame with a similar technique to the back canisters. So just stippling on that metallic black. I did sometimes mix in some normal black acrylic paint as well so that it was a bit deeper, and once I'd built that up to be a nice color, I then took the wire brush and just scratched off a bit of the paint around the edges. We're going to do the same idea for this outer shoulder piece, although adding in a bit more of a brown, bronzy color instead of just a straight black gunmetal. Stippling it on again, it really does just give a nice mottled appearance, which from all the reference photos is what these pieces look like they have. Next onto the outer shoulder cap piece. This already is painted with a base black, and then the front part is chrome, and we're going to be adding some of this bronzy copper color to the black. The copper color is mostly in the central part of the side ring, and I did actually go and add more black and gunmetal to the edges to blend everything in nicely. The last parts of the upper torso area that need work done are the back pieces. And for these, I'm just going in again with my airbrush weathering, adding more water, blotting it off, just building up a nice grimy texture. For these pieces in particular, it's really just to break up the solid color. Obviously, they have quite a lot of the the paint chipping effect from the masking fluid, but paint chipping doesn't happen without other dirt and distress on the piece, so you do want to do a bit of weathering alongside something like masking fluid and paint chipping. A similar idea with the upper arm pieces that are the same beige color, although this time I went in with a brush just so that I could really localize the weathering to the creases alongside the chrome plates on the side of these arms. And you can see what a difference just a little bit of weathering makes on pieces like this. And then it was onto the head, which I did leave for last because I was very paranoid about messing this up. I started out with doing a light mist overspray over the entire thing with a light gray. Then it was a round of the airbrush weathering. I did do this quite light because I didn't want to go too heavy since I'd already built up so many other layers underneath that. It was going to be really hard to fix if I messed this up. And I did that to all of the silver head pieces, so not the one internal cylinder piece. I then went and did something that I annoyingly did not film. I printed one of these splatter tips that you attach to the end of your airbrush, and it creates this like splatter effect super easily, and this looked absolutely incredible on this head. I am obsessed with how this paint job turned out. It just created the perfect texture. The head was really the last main piece that I painted, and everything else were just the head details and any other small details that I wanted to add a little bit more weathering to. The hands and fingers were really the last main painting project, which just got a round of the gunmetal and black stippling weathering texture technique. And that was it for the paint job. So now on to finishing the assembly, starting with this main torso. This definitely had the most pieces that needed to get attached. So started with the lower torso to the main upper torso. Then I added these side bracket things, which did have to use a little bit of force on with a mallet, but thankfully nothing broke. I'm glad I was so confident in my ability to build strong pieces there. This upper cage part is definitely tricky. You have to attach the side pieces first, and then the upper frame neck part has to attach to those side shoulder brackets, but also slip into the back panel. So this miraculously wasn't too bad, but it is definitely a little more finicky than some of the other more straightforward parts, like the back panels, these side canisters, all of the little detail parts. I did end up adding the red stripes to this hose piece when I had it assembled because I wanted to get all of the proportions correct where the stripes actually were in relation to the pieces, and of course had to weather that a bit afterwards as well. And then there were just a couple of more detail pieces that I had to attach. And that was pretty much it for the main intense assembly, because everything else are just pieces that need to be assembled using various bolts and screws. I started with the hands. These use a couple of different lengths of furniture bolts to attach the fingers onto the main hand piece, and you do want to watch that you don't over tighten these. If you tighten them to the perfect amount, then these fingers will be easily posable later. Same goes for the wrist piece. The next thing I tackled were these upper arm pieces. You have the main upper arm section that slides into that beige part, and then these silver plates help hold in that silver cylinder to the beige part with a bunch of bolts and nuts. This lower black piece ended up just being held in there by force. I got it in there, it was a really nice snug fit, and I figured I wasn't going to be able to get it out. There's an inner shoulder joint piece that gets attached to the main shoulder, and from there the upper arm piece goes into this joint and then bolts in place so that it is still movable. There are some particular screws that assemble the next part, and that is the main shoulder cover. So you put the gaiter in first before attaching the shoulder cover with those screws. And here's what the upper arm assembly should look like. There's a lot of range of motion and posability on these pieces. I did go back and paint the screws a bit because they were a pretty bright silver in comparison to the rest of the shoulder. But now would be a good time to talk about these arm gaiters. These are actually resin 3D printed. It is mostly thanks to this mixture using Superflex resin, which is basically like liquid silicone, and these things turned out incredible and absolutely perfect for what they needed to be used for. I did end up spraying mine with some Plastidip just so no additional UV light actually reacted to these, and and possibly harden them, stiffen them beyond what they were. They were the perfect consistency and flexibility as is, so I didn't want to ruin that. I then popped the upper shoulder parts onto the torso so that I could appropriately fit on these front logo embellishment pieces, which we do actually need to specifically talk about for a minute. So this is a picture I took when I was doing a test fit, so pretty soon after that clip that you just watched of me assembling everything. So the front emblem and also technically the front of the outer shoulder cover both were painted in Duralumin, and then I added the rust paste to it, which looked amazing, a perfect effect for what it needed to look like. I looked at this droid 2 weeks later, and this is what that front emblem looked like. And when I tell you, I thought I was absolutely losing my mind that this thing was somehow actually rusting on its own. But I did want to mention it in this video because I did not coat the Duralumin with any other like clear coat or anything, and my hypothesis is the baking soda must have reacted to the paint somehow, because the reason it looks more rusty is because it has pulled the chrome silver color away from the black, and the black is what you can still see. You can see it even better on the shoulder coverings. Thankfully, it still has the effect that I was going for, and the rust paste didn't do this to any other of the paint that I put it on, so it might be a good idea to do a bit of a test if you're worried about something like this happening, but it seems to not be a super prevalent issue because literally none of the other paint that I put this on reacted at all to the baking soda. But yeah, I apparently made my weathering so realistic that it started aging on its own. But back to the main build, the last little assembly bits were all of these detail pieces on the central ring of the head. So there's some pipes that stick out, some little greebly things that actually go into holes, more detail parts, and then the main eye segment actually screws on to the lower ring. I did end up adding some pretty basic electronics to the head. I just soldered up a length of an LED strip to a 9-volt battery and a switch to light up this central head section. The final part of this droid assembly is adding in all of these tubes. These back canisters used some 5mm rubber tubing. Then for the larger tubes coming off of the back canisters, I used some coaxial cable. Same thing for the tubes on the legs, although for these ones I did shave the ends so that they fit into the holes better. It was a bit thick for the pieces. I ended up leaving these thigh covers just being held on by force, which was very handy for me to be able to just thread up these tubes into the holes that are on the bottom of the hip pieces. But there is still something pretty crucial missing from this droid. Its driver. This is a custom-built Grogu that I made specifically to fit into IG-12. He's fully posable, which is going to come in very handy when putting him into this cockpit, which for this I did specifically leave that top panel and also the control board separate and not permanently attached so that I could more easily try and get him into the very tight cockpit area, which the only reason he does actually fit is because I printed his head in flexible resin. So thankfully his ears bend, because he would not have fit past the shoulders otherwise. But from there, it was just getting him situated and posed with holding the little control knobs in his hands and then reattaching that front panel. And here, finally, after almost 9 months of working on this project, is the finished IG-12. So, do you like your new ride?
Yes, yes, yes.
You want to get out of it?
No.
So right now, that's just me controlling it with my phone and a small Bluetooth speaker, but in the future, I'll probably rig up something more permanent, but for now, that works great. Thank you for joining me through this entire process of building IG. I know it's been a long time coming, and I hope for any of you that are interested in building your own IG-12 unit that this video has been a helpful resource for you. But that is everything, so thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video, assuming these two don't take over the place.